The email came on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line read simply, Captain Upgrade Review. I'd been expecting it for weeks, had been checking my inbox obsessively, refreshing every few hours. The timing was right. My hours were sufficient. My check rides had all been passed on first attempts. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. I opened it standing in my kitchen, still in uniform from that morning's flight. Read it once quickly, then again slowly, making sure I understood correctly. The chief pilot wanted to see me Thursday morning at 9, his office, to discuss my readiness for captain upgrade. The formal language couldn't hide what this meant. This was the conversation every first officer waited for. The assessment that determined whether you'd move to the left seat, whether you'd command aircraft instead of assisting, whether you'd be responsible for final decisions instead of supporting someone else's choices. 8 years of building hours and experience led to this meeting. I'd prepared for months, studied procedures beyond what was required, practiced emergency scenarios until responses became automatic, sought feedback from every captain I flew with about areas needing improvement, done everything possible to be ready when this moment arrived. And now it was here. Thursday morning, I arrived at the chief pilot's office 15 minutes early, sat in the waiting area reviewing my logbook on my tablet, checking that every entry was current and accurate, that documentation was complete. The administrative assistant offered coffee. I declined, didn't trust my hands to stay steady holding a cup. Chief Pilot Reynolds called me in at 9 exactly. His office was neat and organized, walls covered with aviation photos and certificates, desk clear except for a single folder with my name on the tab. He gestured to a chair across from him. I sat, kept my posture straight, my expression professional. He opened the folder and reviewed it silently for a moment. I could see pages of my training records, check ride results, captain evaluations from flights I'd worked, years of performance reduced to documentation, numbers and assessments that would determine my future. Reynolds looked up and his expression was serious, carefully neutral. He said my technical skills were excellent, my procedural knowledge was strong, my safety record was spotless, that every metric suggested I was capable of handling the responsibilities of command. That on paper, I looked ready. Then he paused, said that being ready on paper wasn't the same as being ready in practice. That command required more than technical ability, required judgment and confidence that could only come from more experience. That he had concerns about whether I'd accumulated enough seasoning, enough exposure to varied situations. I asked what specific concerns he had, what gaps in my experience needed addressing. He was vague, mentioned that some situations couldn't be trained, could only be learned through time, that rushing the upgrade process sometimes created captains who struggled when faced with unexpected challenges, that a few more years in the right seat would ensure I was truly ready. Told him I'd been flying commercially for 8 years, had logged over 6,000 hours, had worked with dozens of captains and learned from each one, that I'd handled emergencies and difficult weather and complex situations, that my evaluations consistently noted decision-making capability and command presence. Reynolds acknowledged all of this but said that other first officers with similar hours had been held back, had benefited from additional time before upgrade, that this wasn't about doubting my capability, but about ensuring absolute readiness. That command was too serious to rush, that waiting another year or two would only make me a stronger captain. I sat there processing his words, trying to understand what was actually being said underneath the careful language. He wasn't denying my qualifications or my performance. He was saying I needed more time, more experience, more something that he couldn't quite define, but was certain I lacked. Asked directly if there was anything specific I could work on, any particular area needing improvement, before he'd recommend me for upgrade. He repeated the vague assessment about experience and seasoning, about intangible qualities that developed over time. Said I should focus on continuing to learn, on building more hours, on being patient. The meeting ended after 20 minutes. He said we'd revisit this in 6 months, that I should keep flying well and gaining experience, that my time would come when the timing was right. I thanked him for his consideration and left his office, walked through the operations center toward the parking lot. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. I'd met every formal requirement, exceeded most of them, demonstrated capability consistently, but somehow I wasn't ready, needed more time, had to wait for some undefined moment when readiness would be obvious. Called my friend Sarah, another first officer who'd been upgraded to captain 2 years earlier. She listened to my summary of the meeting and was quiet for a moment. Then she asked how many male first officers with my hours had been told to wait for more experience, more seasoning, more intangible qualities to develop. The question hung in the air. We both knew the answer. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Male first officers with similar or even fewer hours got upgraded on schedule. Female first officers heard about needing more time, more experience, more proof of readiness. The standards weren't the same even when the paperwork claimed they were. Sarah said I could challenge it, could file a complaint about discriminatory delay, could push back through official channels. But she also said that challenging often made things worse, created reputation as difficult, made the eventual upgrade harder because you'd be watched more carefully, evaluated more critically. I had a trip scheduled that afternoon, flew to Denver and back, routine operations with a captain I'd worked with several times. He asked how the meeting had gone, whether I'd gotten the green light for upgrade. I explained the outcome, the vague reasoning, the recommendation to wait. He looked surprised. Said he'd been planning to put in a recommendation for my upgrade, that flying with me had always been smooth, that my decision-making was solid and my procedures were tight, that he couldn't understand what more experience Reynolds thought I needed that I didn't already have. His support helped but didn't change anything. Reynolds made the upgrade decisions. His assessment was what mattered, regardless of how many captains thought I was ready. I could have 100 positive evaluations, and they'd mean nothing if he decided I needed more seasoning. Days passed. I kept flying, kept doing my job, kept building hours that apparently weren't enough despite being more than sufficient for others. Watched the roster and saw 2 male first officers with fewer hours than me get moved to captain slots. Their names appeared on the upgrade list while mine stayed in first officer assignments. One of them, Jake, had been hired a year after me. Good pilot, competent and professional, but not exceptional. His upgrade happened smoothly. No meetings about readiness or concerns about experience. Just the standard progression from right seat to left seat, from first officer to captain, exactly as the system was designed to work. I congratulated him, tried to be genuinely happy for his achievement. He was gracious about it, mentioned he was surprised to be upgraded before me given my seniority and experience. Said he'd assumed I'd already been through the process or had chosen to delay for personal reasons. Told him no, that Reynolds had recommended I wait, that apparently I needed more time despite having more hours than Jake did. Jake looked uncomfortable, seemed to recognize the unfairness, but didn't know what to say. The conversation ended awkwardly, both of us aware of the discrepancy but unable to address it directly. Weeks turned into months. I kept flying, kept building experience, kept waiting for whatever magical threshold Reynolds had in mind. 6 months passed, and I submitted a request for another upgrade review meeting. Got scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9, same time slot as before. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The second meeting felt like a repeat of the first. Reynolds reviewed my updated records, noted that my performance remained strong, acknowledged the additional hours I'd accumulated, then delivered essentially the same assessment, that I still needed more time, more experience, more intangible development before he'd recommend upgrade. This time I pushed back more directly, asked what specifically needed to change, what concrete milestone would indicate readiness in his assessment, what the measurable criteria were, what objective standard I needed to meet. He didn't have clear answers, just repeated variations of needing more time and experience. Asked if other first officers with my current total hours had been upgraded. He said each case was individual, that comparing wasn't appropriate, that decisions were made based on comprehensive assessment, not just hours. Technically accurate, but completely evasive, a non-answer that avoided acknowledging the pattern. Left that meeting more frustrated than the first. The vagueness felt deliberate, designed to prevent challenge, structured so that no specific deficiency could be addressed, because no specific deficiency existed. Just perpetual inadequacy based on undefined standards applied inconsistently. Sarah suggested I document everything, keep detailed records of my hours and check rides and evaluations, build a case for eventual challenge if Reynolds continued to delay. That documentation might not force immediate upgrade, but could provide leverage later, could create accountability for decisions that seemed arbitrary. Started keeping careful records. Every flight, every evaluation, every interaction with captains I worked with. Built a file showing consistent, excellent performance, steady accumulation of experience, repeated assessments from other captains saying I was ready for command. Evidence that the only person questioning my readiness was Reynolds. More months passed. I hit 7,000 hours, then 7,500. Flew routes across the country, handled weather and mechanical issues and difficult passengers, demonstrated capability in situations Reynolds claimed I needed more experience with. But the upgrade remained perpetually just out of reach, always requiring more undefined seasoning. Then Sarah called with news. Reynolds was being promoted to a regional management position, would be leaving our base, transferring to corporate in 2 months. A new chief pilot would be taking over, someone named Martinez transferring from the West Coast operation. A change in leadership that might mean change in how upgrades were handled. The announcement came officially a week later. Reynolds would finish his tenure at the end of the quarter. Martinez would assume the chief pilot role starting the 1st of next month. The overlap would be minimal, just enough time for transition of critical information and ongoing situations. I researched Martinez online, found her profile on the airline website, read her bio and background. She'd been a captain for 12 years, had moved into training and evaluation roles, had built reputation as fair and thorough. No obvious red flags, no pattern of discriminatory behavior that I could identify from public information. Sarah knew pilots who'd worked under Martinez at the West Coast base. She made calls, gathered information, tried to get sense of how Martinez operated and what her arrival might mean. The feedback was consistently positive. Descriptions of someone who evaluated based on actual performance rather than subjective feelings about readiness. Reynolds' final weeks were busy with transition activities. I didn't approach him about upgrade again. Didn't want to waste time on conversations that would lead nowhere. Didn't want to give him opportunity to make some final recommendation that might prejudice Martinez against me. Just flew my schedule and waited for the leadership change. Martinez arrived on schedule. She spent the first week meeting with pilots individually, learning about operations, getting sense of the crew base and its dynamics. I got scheduled for a meet and greet session along with several other first officers, a casual introduction rather than formal evaluation. She was professional and direct, asked about our experience and career goals, listened carefully to responses. When I mentioned being ready for captain upgrade, she asked about my timeline, my total hours, my recent check ride results. Made notes but didn't offer assessment, just gathered information. 2 weeks after Martinez took over, the roster for next quarter came out. I checked it immediately, looking for my name in the first officer slots like always. But this time my name appeared in a different section. Captain assignments. Upgrade effective next month. No meeting, no discussion, just the roster change reflecting a decision that had apparently been made. I stared at the screen, reading my name over and over to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Captain slot, 737 equipment, regular line. The upgrade I'd been waiting for, working toward, repeatedly told I wasn't ready for. Suddenly approved without ceremony or extended justification. Called Sarah immediately. She congratulated me, said she'd known Martinez would evaluate fairly, that the transfer had been the break I needed. Asked if Martinez had given any explanation for approving the upgrade Reynolds had delayed. I said no, that it had just appeared on the roster without discussion. Sarah said that was probably intentional, that Martinez had likely reviewed my records and seen obvious readiness, had recognized that further delay would be indefensible, that sometimes the best response to unfair treatment was simply to stop the unfair treatment without calling attention to the fact that it had been happening. The upgrade process moved quickly after the roster posting. Got scheduled for captain training, started ground school and simulator sessions, reviewed procedures and emergency protocols from the perspective of pilot in command rather than supporting crew member. The transition from right seat to left seat, from first officer to captain, from supporting to commanding. The training was intensive but straightforward. Everything I'd been preparing for, everything I'd known I was ready to handle. The check airman noted my proficiency, my thorough understanding of procedures, my capability with emergency scenarios. No concerns about readiness, no suggestions that more time was needed, just professional assessment of demonstrated competency. Passed the final check ride on first attempt. Got signed off as captain qualified, received my new ID with captain designation, had the 4th stripe added to my uniform shoulders. The formal recognition of capability that Reynolds had insisted I lacked despite evidence suggesting otherwise. First flight as captain was Denver to Phoenix, routine domestic route, afternoon departure. My first officer was someone I'd flown with before, experienced pilot who knew me from right seat days. He congratulated me on the upgrade, said he'd enjoyed flying with me as first officer and was confident I'd be excellent as captain. The pre-flight felt different from the left seat. Not because the procedures changed, they were the same regardless of which seat you occupied, but because the weight of final responsibility was different, because every decision was ultimately mine, because command meant something distinct from support even when the technical work was identical. We pushed back on time, taxied to the runway, took off smoothly. The aircraft responded to my inputs exactly as it always had, indifferent to rank or position, just following the physics of control inputs and power settings. But sitting left seat, being the voice on the radio, making the final calls, felt significant. The flight was uneventful. Good weather, light traffic, no issues requiring difficult decisions. But even routine operations felt weighted with command responsibility, with awareness that ultimate accountability rested with me now. That other crew members and passengers trusted my judgment, my experience, my capability to handle whatever situation might arise. Landing in Phoenix was smooth, rolled out straight, exited at the planned taxiway, parked at the gate precisely on time. The first officer commented that it had been a good flight, professional and by the book. I thanked him and we completed the shutdown checklist. My first flight as captain completed successfully. Walking through the terminal felt different with the fourth stripe on my shoulders. Some passengers noticed and nodded respectfully, recognition of rank and responsibility. Gate agents addressed me as captain automatically, the title that had been delayed so long now attached to my name without question. Martinez was in operations when I returned to base that evening. She saw me and asked how the first flight had gone. I reported it had been smooth, that everything had operated normally, that the transition to left seat had felt natural. She nodded and said that was what she'd expected based on my record. Asked if she'd reviewed my previous upgrade requests, the meetings with Reynolds, the repeated recommendations to wait for more experience. She said she'd seen the documentation, had noticed the pattern of delay despite clear qualification, had made the decision to approve upgrade based on objective assessment of capability. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. Said she didn't agree with delaying qualified pilots for vague reasons, that if someone met requirements and demonstrated proficiency, they should be upgraded on schedule. That holding people back without specific justification wasn't fair to the pilot or beneficial to the airline. I thanked her for the fair evaluation, for looking at actual performance rather than subjective concerns. She said that was just standard procedure, that captains should be selected based on capability, not on whether they fit someone's personal template for readiness. That the roster should reflect qualifications, not biases. Weeks passed. I flew more trips as captain, built hours in the left seat, grew comfortable with command authority. The responsibility that Reynolds had insisted I wasn't ready for became routine, normal, just part of the job. Every successful flight was proof that the delay had been unnecessary, that capability had existed before permission to demonstrate it. Other first officers started asking about upgrade timeline, what the process was like under Martinez versus Reynolds. I was careful in responses, didn't want to explicitly criticize Reynolds, but also wanted to acknowledge that standards seemed more clear and consistently applied now. That capability appeared to be recognized more readily. Several female first officers got upgraded in the months following Martinez's arrival. Pilots who'd been waiting like I had, accumulating hours while being told they needed more experience, suddenly found themselves approved for captain training. The pattern Reynolds had established was being reversed. Delays were being corrected. Qualified pilots were being moved to command positions. Jake, the first officer who'd been upgraded before me despite having fewer hours, mentioned the shift in upgrade patterns. Said it seemed like Martinez was processing a backlog, moving through qualified first officers more quickly than Reynolds had. I said that appeared accurate, that qualified pilots were getting upgraded on appropriate timelines now. He looked uncomfortable acknowledging it, but said he'd noticed that most of the backlog being cleared consisted of female first officers, that Reynolds seemed to have held back women while advancing men more readily. That the pattern was obvious once you looked at the data, undeniable even if uncomfortable to acknowledge. I confirmed that appeared to be accurate, but said I wasn't interested in dwelling on past unfairness, preferred to focus on current fair treatment. That Martinez had created an environment where upgrades happened based on qualification rather than other factors, and that was what mattered going forward. 6 months into my captain tenure, Martinez called me into her office. Not for evaluation or concern, but to discuss potential training department role, possibly becoming a check airman for captain upgrades. Said my performance had been excellent, that I'd demonstrated strong command capability, that I'd be good evaluator for pilots transitioning to left seat. The offer was flattering, but I was uncertain. Training roles meant more responsibility but less flying, more time evaluating others instead of operating flights. Asked for time to consider it, to think about whether that career direction interested me. She said to take whatever time needed, that the opportunity would be there when I decided. Talked to Sarah about the offer. She said training positions could be good career moves, opened doors to management roles, provided variety beyond line flying, but also required patience with less capable pilots, required extensive documentation, required giving critical feedback that sometimes wasn't received well. Also said that having more female check airmen would help ensure fair evaluation of future upgrade candidates, that Martinez was probably thinking about that when making the offer. That representation in evaluation roles mattered for preventing the kind of discriminatory delay I'd experienced. That consideration ultimately influenced my decision. Accepted the check airman position, went through evaluator training, learned how to assess other pilots objectively and document observations professionally. Started conducting check rides for captain upgrades, evaluating first officers making the transition I'd made. The role gave me perspective on what readiness actually looked like, what standards should be applied, how to distinguish between genuine gaps needing more experience and artificial barriers based on bias. Helped me see that my readiness hadn't been question marked despite Reynolds' assessment. That capability had been evident to anyone evaluating fairly. Also helped me ensure that future candidates got evaluated based on actual performance, that vague concerns about intangible readiness didn't delay qualified pilots unnecessarily, that when first officers demonstrated capability, they got upgraded without having to wait for some arbitrary threshold that kept moving further away. Years passed. I accumulated time as captain, eventually moved to wide-body aircraft, flew international routes, built experience that Reynolds had claimed I lacked. Every successful flight, every smooth landing, every well-handled emergency was retrospective proof that readiness had existed before recognition, that delay had been barrier, not protection. Sometimes I thought about that first meeting in Reynolds' office, his careful explanation that I wasn't ready despite meeting every requirement. About the months spent accumulating hours that were already sufficient, gaining experience I'd already demonstrated, waiting for permission that should have been granted based on capability. About how the roster change under Martinez had happened so simply, how upgrade had proceeded smoothly once artificial barriers were removed, how capability that was questioned suddenly became obvious when evaluated by someone without preconceptions about who belonged in command positions. The experience shaped how I approached check rides, how I evaluated upgrade candidates, how I determined readiness, not based on feelings or intuitions about intangible qualities, but on demonstrated capability and actual performance. If someone could fly the aircraft safely and make sound decisions, they were ready for command, regardless of what other factors might make me comfortable or uncomfortable. Because the roster change had taught me that gatekeeping based on undefined standards harmed qualified pilots and benefited no one. That arbitrary delays didn't improve safety or create better captains, just frustrated capable people and perpetuated patterns of discrimination that were hard to document, but easy to recognize. The roster had changed. New names appeared in captain slots, first officers moved to command positions, the pipeline progressed as it should when evaluated fairly. That simple administrative update had meant everything to me, had represented recognition that had been unfairly delayed, had opened career progression that should never have been blocked. I made sure that similar roster changes happened for pilots I evaluated, that qualified first officers got upgraded on appropriate timelines, that capability was recognized when demonstrated rather than perpetually questioned. The power to influence rosters came with responsibility to use that power fairly, to evaluate based on performance, not bias. Martinez eventually moved to another position within the airline, transferred to corporate management, was replaced by another chief pilot who maintained the fair evaluation standards she'd established. The culture she'd created persisted. The pattern of equitable upgrades continued. The barriers that had existed under Reynolds remained dismantled. I kept flying, kept evaluating, kept ensuring that rosters reflected capability rather than gatekeeping. The work was pure up there, at altitude, where aircraft responded to competent inputs regardless of who commanded them, where capability mattered and identity didn't, where performance was measurable and standards were clear. The roster kept changing, new captains earning their fourth stripes, first officers moving left, progression happening as designed, each change reflecting recognition of readiness, acknowledgement of capability, removal of barriers that had no legitimate basis. Reynolds had said I wasn't ready. The roster change had proven otherwise. Not through dramatic demonstration or exceptional performance, just through normal, competent operations repeated consistently. The kind of flying that should have been sufficient evidence all along but only became recognized as such when evaluated without prejudice. I kept flying, kept commanding, kept being ready for responsibilities I'd always been capable of handling. The roster confirmed it every time my name appeared in captain slots. Every time the schedule reflected assessment based on actual capability, rather than biased assumptions. Ready for command. Had been all along. The roster change had simply made official what had always been true. The flights continued. The hours accumulated. The capability remained constant. Only the recognition had changed. Only the willingness to acknowledge what had always been evident. only the roster reflecting reality rather than prejudice. That was enough. That was everything. The roster change that meant I could finally do what I'd been ready to do. Command aircraft. Make decisions. Lead crews. Be the captain I'd trained to become and proven capable of being. The roster had changed. Everything else had stayed the same. My capability had been constant, my readiness unwavering, my competence demonstrated repeatedly. Only the official recognition had shifted. Only the willingness to place my name where it belonged. Only the administrative acknowledgement of what others had already known. Chief Pilot Reynolds had said I wasn't ready. The roster under Chief Pilot Martinez had said otherwise. And every flight since had proven which assessment was accurate, which evaluation was fair, which judgment was worth trusting. The roster was truth. The flights were proof. The capability was constant. Only the recognition had needed to change. And when it finally did, when the roster reflected readiness instead of denying it, everything fell into place exactly as it should have from the beginning. I was ready for command. Had always been ready. The roster just needed to acknowledge it. And eventually, under leadership willing to evaluate fairly, it did. That was all. That was everything. The roster changed, and I flew.